Thank you all for coming this morning. My name is Amara. I think I know or have met everybody here, so thank you. I'm going to introduce myself and introduce the project, and then I'm going to hand it over to Michelle, and then Wendy, and then Danny from the British Museum will kind of finish us off at the end. And so, I'm a historian of archaeology. My mom is also from the Caribbean, so this is partly why I'm doing this project. Basically, for those of you who don't know, as a historian of archaeology, I am interested in looking at archives and other primary source materials and secondary source materials to understand how artifacts are recovered, collected, interpreted, and acquired by museums. But I'm also interested in wider political, social, economic, cultural contexts of discovery, collection, interpretation, and acquisition. So I had an opportunity a few years ago, while I was working at Reading, to do a project on collections from Barbados that are in the British Museum. I worked with Michelle, who did illustrations, and we worked on a digital exhibition about Barbadian artifacts in the British Museum. We were doing it during lockdown, so without access to any artifacts or any archives, so basically it was drawn on material that was available digitally, so old reports and articles on Barbadian artifacts in journals and newspapers that are online. And you can have a look, the link is here, you can have a look at the whole exhibition, but this is just an example of one of the illustrations that Michelle produced. Well, actually, it's several illustrations, because there's a map and then illustrations for particular bits. But it's sort of slightly interactive, and you can have a look at your own time. While I was doing that project, it kind of focused on two collectors, Thomas Briggs and Gerald Chester, who were both situated in Barbados in various capacities. And they have kind of integrated themselves, or I integrated them rather, into this project. And I had the opportunity earlier this year to apply for funding from the University of London Knowledge Exchange Fund to work with Wendy and Michelle and Danny and Rose at the British Museum to have a look at some more Caribbean collections in the British Museum from a variety of different places, and actually to go into the stores and to go into the archive and look at all of this material together, which I hadn't been able to do in the earlier iteration of this research. So I came up with a program, and Michelle and Wendy very kindly agreed to work with me, because I was desperately trying to apply for this funding. And we started off, originally my intention was to start off in the museum itself, have a tour of the galleries, but we actually started in the archive, which I think was quite good, actually. And we went to see various letters from various collectors who were sending things into the British Museum. And then we went to see the stores, which are held off-site, where we actually saw artifacts in person, and you'll see pictures of them in a bit. Then we went to the galleries. We also went to the Menil collection, which is held in Stuart House, so really close to here. It's part of the Warburg Institute, but it's where the Image of the Black project is situated. And I wanted to integrate that into the project because this was an opportunity for us to look at how African Caribbean people had been portrayed in Western art, which is what the Image of the Black project is all about. I mean, not just African Caribbean people, but there are images of African Caribbean people in the Menil collection. So that was quite a good visit. And then I had work in progress discussions with both Wendy and Michelle, but in two different locations that were not the British Museum. Wendy and I went to the Royal Geographical Society to look at an archive that relates to one of the artifacts that we investigated. And Michelle and I went to the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, which also has Caribbean artifacts on display. And then we had some discussions about other kinds of resources that were available, and today is the final event of the project. And I want to thank everyone who's been a part of it, so Danny and Rose and Paul and Bill and Maria from the Warburg and Michelle and Wendy, obviously. So thank you all. So I wrote a sort of midpoint blog post, which is now up at this site. So this is the project page site, and Wendy has written progress blogs on her own blog, which are linked in this blog. So if you want to see the sort of beginnings of the project, have a look at that. Right, so we started really with a list. And I asked, when we started the project, I asked Wendy and Michelle what places they were interested in, just so we could define a sort of a boundary around the project. And both of them said Barbados, which I was also quite interested in. And Wendy added Guyana. And then I added St. Vincent and Nevis and Jamaica. And I added Grenada because that's where my mom grew up, so it has quite a personal connection. And I looked for a variety of different materials. So Wendy and Michelle were both interested in pottery, so there was a bit of pottery there. But we also had musical instruments, tools of various kinds, a canoe model, a seat. So it was a variety of different things. And as you can see, Graham Briggs and Gerald Chester were both in the mix, but alongside a number of other people. We didn't actually see archives that were related to all of these people, because the British Museum archive is a complicated beast. But we did see some, and it was really interesting. So this is an example of one of the letters that we saw. This is from Gerald Chester. He wrote it from Barbados in 1868, and he was sending in artifacts that he had collected on the island. You can see Arab implements here. He was sending them into Augustus Woolston Franks, who was the keeper of the Department of Britain Medieval Antiquities and Ethnology, I think it was. The department names have changed over the course of time, which makes everything more complicated. But Franks was really a key individual for the collection of quite a lot of Caribbean material on the British Museum end. And this letter not only discusses Chester's interest in antiquities, but also reveals that he was particularly interested in collecting stone material. But all he was able to get at this stage was shell material. So he said, shells are okay. I quite like those. I'm sending you a few. And he also mentions in this letter that he was sending, that the items from his collection had been exhibited in the UK. And so it gives you a sense of the sort of circulation of material. So our next trip was to the stores. And here you can see Wendy and Michelle looking at the canoe model, which was one of the collections that was sent to the museum by Everard Imthorn, who was a collector and a curator in the Royal Agricultural Society of Guyana's museum. And he collected a quantity of material which he then sent to the British Museum with a fairly detailed catalog, which we saw when we went to the archive. So the canoe model is part of that collection. This was an interesting piece. You can kind of see a face on it, but we weren't exactly sure which direction the face should be in. We turned it, there's a way you can turn it where it looks like a face is on in a different angle. It's hard to explain, but anyway, this was an artifact that was acquired by a man called George Hammond Hawting, who was and a sort of colonial official working in St. Vincent. And there was, after we went to the archive, Francesca, who's the archivist, was able to locate a letter that related to this, the artifacts that Hawting had collected from St. Vincent. And it wasn't actually from Hawting himself, it was from someone who was working as his agent in London. But in it, he kind of indicates that Hawting was prepared to act as a kind of British Museum collector in St. Vincent because he was well connected. I only have 5 minutes left, and I have to race through. So this is one of the shell implements from Chester's collection in Barbados, and this is a rat trap, supposedly from Jamaica, and this is a stone tool from Jamaica, and so this slide is just to say that there was an American room at one stage in the British Museum's collection where some of these artifacts would have been on display. But now, the majority of artifacts are on display in the Enlightenment Gallery. This case has a stool from the Bahamas in it, but there are also, there's a Jamaican figure in one of the cases, kind of towards the Mexico Gallery. And then there's quite close by to this is this case of war clubs from Guyana, one of which was actually on display in the 1851 Great Exhibition, as I discovered last week. Michelle and I went to the Slavery Museum, where you can see artifacts on display here. And Wendy and I went on the trail of the rat trap at the Royal Geographical Society. Unfortunately, the archives didn't say anything particularly about this archive, but they did have some quite interesting other bits about William Scoresby Routledge's exploits in Jamaica. So just to sort of pick up some of the collection's histories, this is an ads from the Briggs collection, and you can see there's a sort of semi-contemporary guidebook from the 1890s in which it reflects the fact that Graham Briggs was buying this material from African Caribbean people for a penny apiece. This is from Chester's book, which he wrote after he came back from his time in the Caribbean. And you can see again, he collects things from African Caribbean people. This is from St. Vincent. It's probably a bit hard to see, but this says Ley Valley on the object itself. And it has this indication that locally, these artifacts are known as thunderbolts, which is quite interesting, and I think will come up later on. This is a stone tool from F.S. Church's collection. F.S. Church was a police inspector in Jamaica, and a very, very prolific collector of stone tools. This is from a 19th century journal article from the Institute of Jamaica's Journal, which is all about the antiquities of Jamaica. And again, you can see here the note that if you go to country people and you ask for thunderbolts, you get to see a sense of how these objects are integrated into everyday life. Right, so that's it for me.
Hi everyone, I'm Michelle. So yeah, this is just going to be a quick run through of my work in progress. So I worked, as you said, back at the year 2020. So it's been really good to be able to actually get into the archives physically and see things in person this time. So we did it entirely remotely during the pandemic for our last project. So I'm going to talk to you about an alternative approach to the curiosity, the idea of the cabinet of curiosities, and how that idea came about. So it starts with our visit to the British Museum and my first trip ever to the Room of Enlightenment, and how that sort of sparked an idea for the way in which I'd go with this project illustration-wise. So just a few notes on the Room of Enlightenment and what it's trying to say. So it's aiming to give a sense of how objects were organised and displayed in the 18th century. But now we could be asking ourselves, is it still working and is it fitting for modern audiences in the way they want to view and interact with not only objects but their histories and collections histories as well. And then we had a look when we were there about how the Caribbean was represented in the museum. So there wasn't very many objects. Some were in dark cabinets, and that was the nature of the actual display cabinets as well. I think that they were very old. But it means that a lot of the objects that are there aren't accessible, you can't see them, they're not, you know, they're quite low down. There is a lack of information available about a lot of objects. So you'd have to sort of actively look yourself by finding the museum number and then going online, trying to find it on the website. There were typos in some of the old cabinet cards as well, so the Caribbean is misspelled in the cabinet. Crucially, there's beautiful artwork by Charmaine Walkers, which is hidden behind a bust of Soane. So the first thing you see when you come in is this bust of Soane, and you know the narrative around that, which is good. But then Charmaine's amazing artwork is on the back. So. Personal reflection as a visitor, I found this space to be entirely overwhelming, and I found the lack of information in it disappointing as well. So it just felt like this huge, vast space that was filled with objects floor to ceiling. And although there was a methodology that went into how the items were all grouped together and things like that, objects grouped together, from a visitor's point of view, it doesn't come across that way, and that's sort of my personal experience. But from this, it got me thinking about this idea of the curiosity cabinet and how we can sort of flip that a little bit and make it something that provides a bit more information. So these are all the sort of questions I started asking myself when I was thinking about going down the route of drawing a curiosity cabinet and what that might look like. But I just want to focus on how it's used in a domestic space, because that was kind of my inspiration for it, really. So it got me thinking about the cabinet that I've got at home and how I use that. And it's nothing on the scale of the British Museum or anything like that. It's a small cabinet in my house where I keep things that I might have picked up on holiday or things that are important to me, and I display them. You know, I've got the sorts of things that I might want to show to friends when they come around. In the top of the cabinet, in the bottom part of the cabinet, is things that are important to me, but maybe I don't want to show. But this doesn't have to be a cabinet in your own homes. It could be a shelf or a bookcase. So I want to sort of, with this, try and change the narrative and welcome people into the cabinet to take a look around and dig deeper. So go into those spaces that you wouldn't normally be allowed to in someone's house. So with this, I've given a sort of key to unlocking Caribbean history. So the idea is this will sit on a website, and you'll be able to go on and you'll see this as you log onto the site. So it says that this online exhibition aims to take you on a journey. On this website, you will find an old cabinet filled with objects, drawers and cupboards. Each area of the cabinet includes a keyhole, which represents the fact that these objects and their histories have been locked away. It isn't an ordinary cabinet of curiosities though. You're free to look around at your own pace to explore the histories of objects, find out about the work that goes on in the background of museums, and learn about opportunities to bring the important histories of the Caribbean to life. This is your key to unlocking the hidden Caribbean histories at the museum. And then we've got the cabinet. So this is how I've sort of grouped it. On the top, we've got objects from the archive that are not currently on display. The middle drawers is all background work, so letters that we transcribed in the archives, things the public wouldn't be able to interact with usually. Information about the project and archive work, so a little bit about what we did. And audio for Wendy Shearer, which I won't into any spoilers, but yeah, I'll cover that briefly. And then the bottom cupboards, I thought about opportunities. So what were the things that I saw across the different museums and archives that sort of tied them together, that means we can work better together. I'm also still thinking about this idea that was Amara's idea, about this idea of a hidden drawer in the cabinet somewhere as well. So that is something to think about, so I'll welcome any ideas that anyone has. So this is how you would sort of interact with it. So all of the objects are in the cabinet and you'd be able to click on and open up an object card. And this text isn't finalised, by the way, it's kind of just to illustrate how it would look. On the website, you'd have an illustration of the object, and I've chosen the rat trap because I think it fascinated all three of us. So where's it from? Who is it found by? Who is it sold by or to? And then information about this object. But crucially, I think it's important to include things that we don't know yet and what we're doing to address it. So I think that's one of the things that was missing from the Room of Enlightenment, where if you just don't know anything, it's on display still, and there's no information, and there's no sort of, the public don't know if you're actually trying to seek out that information or rectify it. So just being really transparent about it. And then we go down to the middle drawer. So here we've got the letters and a shell artifact as well, which is the one that we've got in the presentation before, and some of the Chester letters. So, and again, this is buildable, so as you do more research and as you have more items and as you can tie them in with more letters, you can add to this space. So you could click on, see a bit of a narrative about letters, why they're important and why they're important to use in researching. Again, an object card about the object relating to the letters, and then information, and then the transcript of the letter as well. So you get to interact with that. And that came about as well, kind of inspired by some of our museums in Liverpool, where we do have openable drawers that you can interact with in museums and see things like letters that you wouldn't normally see that are hidden away. And then we come on to the next drawer down, where we've got two items in this drawer. So we've got a link to the audio, so that's something that could link off to Wendy's story trial, and then a photo album as well. So this is the background work that we've been doing in the stores. So I do think it's something that people are genuinely interested to learn about more. So, and again, it's something that can be added to, so we can use all of our pictures from the museums and archives that we've visited, but we could also think about adding in reflections from people who work in the archives, like Daniel Rose, you know, and anyone else who wants to work on these projects can add in their own sort of picture and what they're doing in it. So yeah, just a couple of examples in there, but also there's opportunity to link off to other reading as well, and that's something else that I'd like to do on it. So on here we've linked up to Wendy's book. And then finally the bottom cabinets. So I've included the Barbados pennies here, and the reason why is because it came up 3 times during this project. So it came up in the image of the Black and Western Art project. We saw some images of them there. The British Museum has some that I don't think are on display, and then we saw them again in the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool. We saw and they had quite a good narrative around the Queens as well. So this bottom bit is all about opportunities. So the main things I was thinking of is what can we learn from other museums about objects like the Barbados pennies and how they can be displayed. Is there an opportunity, does it prompt an opportunity to research and share knowledge about currency systems of Indigenous people in the Caribbean before English colonists? And what stories can we tell about things like this as well? Similarly, with the right-hand side of the cabinet, when you click on that, it brings up this illustration that's done based on an image found in the image of the Black and Western Art project. And this interested me because it had a handwritten note in pencil on the original drawing, which said Tommy Thomas and Dubois St Andrews. So again, opportunities-wise, it's thinking about how we can start looking at those thousands of images that are in our archive. Can we use them in conjunction with collections, histories, and with exhibitions in museums, alongside objects on display and storytelling trails? Could there be opportunities to carry out further researches on individuals that appear in these images as well, and tell their histories and stories? And then just before I come to the end, I wanted to include this in the website as well. So this is something that I think, again, we do quite well in museums in Liverpool about feedback from people visiting. So this was at the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool. So it providing QR codes around the museum where people can give feedback in the moment as well, or go back, reflect, and then give feedback later. And it fosters an environment where people are heard and included in how their own histories are presented in the museums. So tied into this project, I just wanted to include this at the end of it, and provide some prompts for people about how they can share thoughts and ideas about visiting an online exhibition. Do you have any ideas? What histories would you like to see represented? Are you a museum or researcher? And I've been really conscious about including this independent aspect of it as well, so people feel like if you're, for example, researching your family history and you want to take part in a knowledge exchange, that you can reach out and join up with a project and find out more, share what you know, and work collaboratively. So just finally, just thinking about looking to the future. So just this idea of transparency I think is really important. So letting people dig deeper themselves. People want to know this information. You know, we shouldn't hide it. We've got so much, and share them what we don't know and why we don't know it as well, because what we do know is important. And I think, again, reflecting back on my initial visit to the Room of Enlightenment, that's something that really struck me, was that you know, we should be saying if we don't know about something, why don't we know? We do know nothing about it. Can people get in touch if they have information to share on a particular object or its history? So not leaving blank spaces, but offering space to find out more. Webhosts and Quizzy work together to host this exhibition online. Knowledge sharing, can we work together across the country to learn from museums and art galleries, and from the people whose histories that we are presenting in museums as well. And that is it. So just any thoughts, ideas and questions?
Hello everyone. As you know, my name is Wendy Shearer. I am a professional storyteller and I'm a writer. I'm an author of collections of African and Caribbean folktales and myths and legends, books for children and books and stories for adults as well. As a storyteller, I spend a lot of time in schools. I also work a lot with the British Museum and museums and galleries, lots of arts institutions, performing, consulting, sometimes leading workshops in the art of storytelling. And when Amara approached me about the project, I was so excited because over the last couple of years, I've been spending more time working with archives and institutions around the country, looking at how people can change the perspective, or institutions can change the perspective of the content that they're sharing. So mixing true stories with myth and legend and folklore, and writing it not necessarily from a traditional colonial point of view. So I've done some work with Buckinghamshire Archives, and in the middle of some oral history projects with B&A and Hansard Gallery, Southampton, Black Archives as well. So this to me was fantastic, because I didn't know what I was going to do at the start of it all. So I'm really pleased that Amara and Michelle have kind of given you an overview of what we did, because what I'm going to do now is ask us all to bring your biggest imagination and not focus so much just on the objects and the facts and the history, but see if we can mix all of that up with an artistic, creative response. So my response to this was to offer an idea for the museum to have a virtual and on-site trail, a storytelling trail. A trail that could reimagine the past with all of those historical facts and artifacts, but something that celebrates the present Caribbean communities in this country and around the world. So I'm doing a lot of work with oral histories at the moment, interviewing people from different Caribbean communities, and it would be such a pleasure and honour and bridging if people could actually see their history celebrated today, and not have it synonymous just with scandal and silence and things being hidden away. So I thought a storytelling trail. And the trail would be alongside all of those magnificent letters that you've seen, that we looked at and transcribed, the articles, the books, the images from collectors, curators, artists, so much information. But the stories would be from the view of the Indigenous people. and the enslaved people and the labourers. It would be from that perspective, it would be from the perspective of the Caribbean community today. And with all of those, we would mix it with legends and myths and myth and folklore. So you might be thinking, well, why stories? Stories are for children. We just need all of the historical fact. But what I found when we visited the stores and the Enlightenment Room in the British Museum is that looking at these collections, these items as standalone things, don't really give you much of a picture at all. Even if you see a small card with a little bit of information, it's usually about the collector. And the stories are integral to the culture and the history of these items that were used. And our stories, the oral stories in particular, are actually created from conversations that the people had whilst they were using these artifacts, whilst they were using these objects. They created and told these stories and proverbs to keep some of the secrecy of the culture alive. And so I've got this little quote here, which was collected from Peggy Appiah, an author who went over to Ghana and visited the Ashanti people well over 100 years ago, and taught and collected many proverbs. And he said to her, in the old days, if I had told you this stone was a tortoise, you would have seen it get up and walk. And I believe that means that the stories and true life, the objects, are just part of life. They're not things to be separated. So, let's imagine this storytelling trail. I'd like you to think that perhaps the trail, if it was a real trail in the museum, that it could be items that are displayed in various rooms inside the museum, or it could be a single location, as in Michelle's wonderful cabinet of curiosities. But for me, the idea of a trail represents a journey. And it also reflects what really jumped out at me with these letters is how collectors hopped along from the various islands, picking up and trading and selling and swapping and collecting things from country to country. So let's go on that trail. And these items can be scattered and moved around the museum, which is also representative of the African Caribbean diaspora, which is scattered across the world. So our tour today is going to look at St. Vincent and Grenada, Barbados, British Guyana, and Jamaica. It's just a snippet of the islands. So starting in St. Vincent and Grenada, I was thinking, wouldn't it be nice if we imagined, just for a moment, if we could see these wonderful celts, the stones that Amara showed you, and the axes, alongside the articles by, for example, archaeologist Theodore Dubuis, Sir Robert Johnson's letters, Gerald Chester's references, and hear a story of how these Celts, known as thunderbolts to the local people, how the villagers used them. Wouldn't that be wonderful? So that we'd have a bigger picture. So I thought, why don't we just imagine what that story, a snippet of what that story would be like. And as I am a storyteller, we have to get involved with the story. So I invite you all to travel with me across the Caribbean Sea. If you'd like to hear my tale, when I say crick, you say crack. Crick! Crack! How you reply to me tells me how much you really want to hear this story. So I ask you again, crick! Crack! I think we are ready to. We're going to begin on the beautiful islands of St. Vincent and Grenada. I want you to imagine the air so still and so hot that everything is moving so slowly. You can feel the sun on your face, the sea breeze on your back, and the people are working hard. But they are moving very, very slow. Time does not exist. They are working, cutting, chopping, digging, hoeing, planting, sifting. But in the midst of all of this stillness, there are men. Important-looking men. And their voices are urgent and insistent. We are in search of specimens. We are in search of artifacts from the pre-Columbian tribes. hoeing, planting, shifting. And so the voices become louder and a little bit more urgent. We'll give you 25 cents a piece, no matter that we might get £4 for them later. Why should we even pay? They whisper to themselves. It costs them nothing except to stoop over and pick it up. They are lucky we give them anything at all. And so the people ignore them. They have never heard of the word Celts. What is a Celt? What is a Celt? Do you know what a Celt is? I didn't know what a Celt was. Some made-up word. They had no idea. A Celt, a stone tool. They had their own words. And so, to find out what that meant, I'd like you to join in a little call and response. Let's see if you can just say the word, just one word after every line that I say. I'd love you to sing the word Cantelay. Can you say that? Let's try it out. Cantelay. Cantelay. A little bit more energy. Cantelay. Again. Cantelay. Okay, so after every line I say, you say Cantelay. Great, great. One day. Cantelay. I went down the bay. Cantelay. Saw some white men. Cantelay. Eating sweet sugar cane. Cantelay. Looking for stones. Cantelay. And they asked us for some. Cantelay. We wouldn't give them. Cantelay. Cantelay. They hid them away beneath a coconut tree, beneath a wooden house, beneath a doorstep, in a water jar, in a tiny small boat. Now you might wonder why? Why were they hiding these stones? Why were they keeping these stones? Well, if you look among the letters and the references, they will tell you why, these archaeologists and these collectors. These silly people, they're superstitions. They believe that these stones fall from the sky and protect them from lightning. These silly people, they believe that they have fallen from gods. But really, they knew that they were collecting these stones that were there hundreds of years before them, inscribed with images of their gods. And so the villagers would look up and believe that the thunder gods made them fall from the sky, 7 feet deep beneath the earth. And they would take 7 years long to rise to the ground. And if you kept them in your water jar, if you boiled them with some water, they would keep you strong for 7 years long. Oh yes, they had superstitions. But doesn't everyone? Don't we believe in lightning never strikes the same place twice? Is it so different? Maybe. But we'll leave those villagers there for a moment in the wonderful island of St. Vincent. And as you can see here, this is the same image from Chester's collection, which perhaps we could have on display with an audio story or a short story. Now I'd like us to hop over to the island of Barbados on our tour. And as you also heard earlier, Chester was looking for those stones, those Celts, but he couldn't find them. Well, sometimes he could. But he also was looking for these wonderful shell implements. We don't really fully know how they were used, but we could imagine. And it would be wonderful, wouldn't it be nice if these beautiful shell pieces were displayed alongside the letters and articles from Briggs and telling the shell tools and what he's traded and shared, and from other collectors from other islands. We don't always know exactly where they were located from. Wouldn't it be nice if we could see them and also imagine how they were first created and then reinterpreted by the by the Caribbean people? Let's imagine. If you'd like to hear my tale, I'll say quick, you say track. Let's imagine that on the island of Barbados, that tiny island sitting on the southern curve of islands out in the windward sea, that there are people there that have been brought to the land. There are labourers, there are villagers, there are convicts, people in chains for all kinds of reasons. And they're eating, they're cooking, they're also mourning their dead, singing and chanting for 9 days long. They're celebrating, they're dancing, they're chanting and connecting with their ancestors. The letters, they speak of how all of these people are drunken and labouring and falling about in the evenings, but they're really reaching out to their ancestors. Imagine on this trail if we could hear of all of their stories, the keeper of the stories, who is Anansi. And for those of us that don't know Anansi, he is a folklore hero, a character that was brought over with the enslaved Africans to the Caribbean islands. And he may seem like a trickster spider or an animal, fun, childish story, but in fact, he is a symbol of cultural resistance. And so late at night, when everybody was singing and chanting and telling their tales, they were also telling hidden stories, secret stories with different messages that the powers that be could not understand, along with the resistance magic that was forbidden at the time, as we hear in these letters. But wouldn't it be nice if we could hear some of those tales? And I'll tell you a little bit more about Anansi later on. We will just leave Barbados and the people there for a moment. Oh, I should have pointed out the quote. They were offered a penny apiece for some of these wonderful shell tools. But now I'd like to swiftly move over to Guyana, which is where, in fact, my family are from. My parents are from Guyana, my grandparents are from Barbados, and so it was wonderful for me to be able to be showing my family some of these artefacts, as when I was visiting as a child many times in Guyana, we'd bring home some things, and I just thought, oh, I don't want a bow and arrow in my bedroom. Why have we got a hammer from Essequibo? It just felt like, I just couldn't connect with it at all, but in fact, we were surrounded by all of these beautiful objects, and so when I saw some of them there in the stores, I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, this is part of our history. And so we got to see a drum from the Makushi peoples, one of the groups of people in Guyana, the indigenous groups of people, a model canoe, and a stool, which I thought would be wonderful if all of these were displayed alongside, in the archaeologist, his letters and articles that catalogued fine specimens that he gathered and the articles that he wrote about these West Indian tools. But I don't want to focus too much on it. I want us to go even further back with our imagination. Sorry, my presentation's got a little bit wonky there. But wouldn't it be nice if, alongside all of those articles and letters that we've got access to online, if we could go beyond over 3,000 years before that and think about who actually created these objects? We know that the Carib-speaking people were maritime people. They were expert navigators, because the country of Guyana, which actually means rivers that flowed, talks about, stories mention, how they created these dugout canoes to ride along those rivers. And as they created those canoes, we could have stories of their chanting, their singing, their drumming. They told tales under the stars. And one of the stories that we could have on our storytelling trail is the legend of the Victoria Amazonica. And for those of you that don't know, it's a giant water lily, which is so impressive to see. I think there's one in Kew Gardens. But the legend tells of a Carib girl who sailed in her dugout canoe at night, desperate on a quest to reach the moon and the stars. And this was because the Caribs believed that if you physically touched anything in nature, its beauty would be transformed onto you. And so this girl sailed, and she climbed and she scrambled, and she was desperate to reach the moon and the stars. She sat down at night with all of her villagers, trying to listen how they could climb mountains and reach. But her quest sadly led her to the reflection in one of the rivers. She dived down below and would have died to her death if it wasn't, they say, for the goddess, the water goddess Atterbury, who took pity on her, a leader was her name, and transformed her into the Guyanese Victoria Amazonica, the largest water lily in the world. And that is a very, very condensed version of the story. But you get my meaning, that we can take the story that actually is filled with content about how people created their clothing and fibres and used these canoes, and bring it up to date with a story of things that you can see today in nature. And the images of a carry boat, which I thought was amazing, that was also in the stories. And we could also have that on our trail as an example of what they used whilst they were sitting and telling the stories. And sticking with Guyana, let's go beyond Thomas Bishop Duggan, and you might remember that Amara mentioned him, a collector of wooden clubs. I think he was also a plantation owner. He was wealthy in Guyana, and one of his clubs, I think, is in display in the magnificent Enlightenment Room, which you've also seen in an earlier picture. And I was able to see some more clubs in the storehouse. And I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if alongside these clubs, we didn't just have information about T.B. Duggan, but we also had stories about the different types of clubs, because there's such an array in the storehouse. There are different shapes, paddle shapes, spatulas, daggers, blocks. They weren't just all weapons, they weren't all just used in conflict. Some of them were used in ceremonial stories and dances, and we know, based on some of the information that we have here, that they were displayed, or one of them was displayed at the 1851 Great Exhibition. There was even a stand for British Guyana. So let's have our own stories here of the different groups of people who were indigenous to Guyana, the Makuzi, the Arawak, the Wara, the Wapishana, and alongside that, why not have another story? We could have the legend of the hummingbird, for example, which tells the tale of two star-crossed lovers from these two groups, the Arawaks and the Caribs. They fell in love, they were separated by the Kakik chief, her father, and he kept her on the village land, refused to let her escape anymore and be with this man. And so they say that out of desperation, she begged and cried out just before she was about to be wed to someone else. She called out to the god Yokahu, son of the goddess Atterbury, and begged to be released from this pain. And they say he took pity on her and transformed her into a beautiful red flower, placed on the hillside of the Caribbean. But her lover, he was so distraught, he called out for help too, and so he was transformed into a tiny bird, a bird which beats its wings so fast it sounds like a hum. And they say this bird darts from flower to flower, still searching for its true love. Okay, let's move swiftly on from Guyana. We'll go further up north to Jamaica, our last stop on our storytelling trail. And I've got an image here of the rat trap, which really had us we just didn't know what this was, how it was to be used, how could it possibly be a rat trap, and we've all done little various bits of research on it. And with Amara, we went and visited the Royal Geographic Society and read letters where Rutledge didn't mention the rat trap, but he spoke at length in his letters about his time visiting the Jim Crow Mountain, planning the expedition and integrating with the Maroon people. And it got me thinking about, because he moaned quite a lot in his letters that he couldn't get much information out of them, these ignorant people, they wouldn't tell him anything. He couldn't find out all the secrecy behind the poisons that we use and the medicinal herbs that we use to treat and heal him. How dare they not tell him? And so I thought, yes, what about that secrecy? So how about we think about, we display this wonderful rat trap which was made by the Maroon people, the secret narrative that goes alongside these stories. So, as well as perhaps having the letters, we could also have stories of how the Maroons even began. The story of Queen Nanny of the Maroons, the only female resistant leader. who was taken from, we think, the Akan people and brought to Jamaica. And I was going to tell you a story of her, but I think we'll have to leave that there and just leave that as a suggestion that we could have that story of her, and how even today you cannot find out the location of the community, but they remember her to this day. They have a picture of Nanny's face on the Jamaican dollar. They have ships named after her. So why don't we remember her alongside some of the artifacts that we have? And you might wonder, well, why all of this secrecy, apart from the obvious that they couldn't trust the people? But I thought we could also have, as well as a true story of Nanny, we could also have one of the folk tales of Anansi, or many of the folk tales, or just information of Anansi being known as Anansi Sem, which basically means spider stories. And within these stories, there are lots of proverbs, cryptic phrases, because that's the culture. We don't want to share with you all of our secrets because we were stripped of everything else. They thought we would keep this to ourselves. So you have to decipher it. And wouldn't that be wonderful to have the proverbs and the stories and allow people to try and dig deeper and uncover the meanings themselves? I don't think I've got time to tell you one of those stories, but there is an amazing story called Anansi and the Secret Challenge. And at the end of the story, when he tries to cheat death, he is asked by the king, who obviously represents the powers that be, Anansi, how did you manage to obtain these magical, wonderful objects? And Anansi replies with a proverb. He says in the language of the Akan people, "Ah, my king, yes, that bird is called Sewante Asankoti," which means, if you are not wise enough to listen, you will never, ever learn the truth. And so we'll leave Anansi there today, and if you want to, you could look back at a couple of the other proverbs. Sorry, it's got a little bit smudged there. But one of his favourites is, "A cunning bird is caught with planting fibres." Does anybody know what that might mean? It's tricky, isn't it? Planting fibres, which I think is a wonderful reference to some of the fibres that we know are used, pulled out from trees and made with, as clothing by the women on some of the islands. But it basically means that someone who's very clever and devious will never go off and steal something great and big. They will just take something small. And so when you find them, that's why. Anyway, I have gabbled enough. Just to end, I just wanted to suggest that I hope that you've enjoyed the storytelling tour. It's just a taster of what perhaps we could have to broaden the narrative of our Caribbean history, more than poorly lit, sparsely curated specimens and implements and artifacts in the language of relics, but actually a story that shows everything that breathes life into these things that still exist. So we could have a storytelling trail of layers alongside the folklore, myth and legends to represent the wealth of complex Caribbean history and its connections with the world. Thank you very much.
So, good morning everyone. Thanks again to Amara and Wendy and Michelle for this lovely invitation to participate in this project in the first place. On behalf of myself, my colleagues from the British Museum, Rose, Jim, Francesca, and the others that participated. I am a historical archaeologist of Mexico and Peru, which is to say I'm not a Caribbean expert. So I was a bit relieved when Amara only asked me to talk for 5 minutes. But at the same time, throughout this morning, first I've learned a lot. This is the first time I see a lot of this output from this wonderful project. And I took a lot of notes, so we'll see how much I can actually cover in 5 minutes. So first, I would like to applaud this wonderful multidisciplinary approach that they've been taking to this project. Not just looking at objects, as many archaeologists or scholars, for that matter, who visit the collection would do, but also integrated with the archival and oral tradition and local knowledge. For example, in the case of the rat trap, that was an amazing application for that. But again, that kind of and interdisciplinary application is typically a good model for any academic project, research project, but in this case, they brought together also artistic and public-facing outputs, which again is something amazing that we don't typically see in these type of projects that come into the museum, at least not ones that engage with collection. And this is really the best way to tell those stories of agency and resilience, like Amar actually put it. Because again, we have to bring all these different types of information and understanding of the past and application into the present. I just want to mention that at the British Museum, we did some research on Caribbean collection, mostly recently through Sellers, Santo Domingo Center of Excellence for Latin American Research, looking at some collections in Guyana, Istmo, Colombia, Dominica, and more recently the Garifuna communities. But we don't see that many visitors or people who engage with the Caribbean collections from beyond the museum. So again, that was a wonderful opportunity, definitely for me, to engage with these collections and learn a lot from this team. In terms of number of objects, I had to look it up. We have about 10,000 objects from the Caribbean. If you look at the collection online, out of which I can probably count in one hand, maybe I'll need to use a couple more fingers to count how many objects are actually on display out of these 10,000 objects. And as mentioned here by all three presenters, these are actually not displayed in a very in a gallery that is conducive to actually giving credit to these objects and to these stories. The Enlightenment Gallery. The Enlightenment Gallery has a specific theme to it, again, telling that story, maybe the early story of the museum or how the museum looked like 100 to 100 years ago, but it doesn't actually, again, give credit to these objects, to these stories, and to the people specifically who made these objects. So, again, I was thrilled to see that Wendy took this idea of Cabinet of Curiosity and gave it a new twist in this digital exhibition. This was a wonderful idea. I think they kind of twisted the idea on its head. I agree again that this room in itself is overwhelming. So all this input in terms of the visitor's experience is extremely valuable. And again, the integration of the space itself, as it is right now, with a digital exhibition, as described by Michelle, is fantastic, including the interactive aspect of it and linking to other projects. And I specifically took to heart your point about transparency and also emphasizing what we don't know, because this is something we don't do as often. So in terms of benefits and other applications, obviously updating and correcting the record. This is something we always need to do and keep doing in our work as curators, but also again, thinking of how we tell effective stories to the public. So we mentioned here the Collecting an Empire Trail, which is still forming within the museum, started in 2019. But now we have this wonderful idea of the storytelling trail. This is a great idea. We have to pitch it to our interpretation team. One of the things I really like here is think about who made the original collection, because oftentimes these stories focus on the usually white male collectors who collected it in the place of origin and then sold it or donated it to another white male curator at the museum. We don't see actually all the people who actually made those collections in the field, in the landscape. In this case, in the case of the Caribbean, obviously, we talk about enslaved people, Afro-descendants, and even if in most cases we cannot actually name them, at least we can able to reconstruct or try to reconstruct some context about them, and at the very least acknowledge them and specifically acknowledge their contribution to knowledge. Okay, and again, this is something very important that we oftentimes forget to do when we look at collection histories. We have a couple of projects now on collection histories, focusing specifically on Mexico and Peru, and this is something, in fact, that just by participating in this project and listening to this wonderful presentation got me thinking that this is definitely something we should focus more on. All of this, again, is, in terms of applications and benefit, could obviously translate into temporary exhibitions. This is something we can definitely think about and talk about more, but the idea, obviously, ideally, is a permanent exhibition on the Caribbean. Again, we have only 5, 6 objects on display in the Landman Gallery, and only with these 10 plus or 15 objects that they're able to see in the collection, they already open a wide world of stories, new stories to tell. This is something that, in fact, we are thinking about in the specific context of the Reimagining British Museum project. This is something that may not happen right away. In fact, we have a few more years till we can see some changes within the museum along this project, but this is a project that is geared toward reimagining the Americas and Caribbean collections, art collections, to have a better representation of these parts of the world which are currently unrepresented in the museum, and the integration of technologies is key to that. It's not just the cases and the objects, it's obviously all the digital technologies, for example, an application that we saw a wonderful example here today. And most importantly, I think what this project also showed us is a model for collaborative, multidisciplinary work with scholars, source communities, and artists, which is, again, something that we definitely need to apply to each and every exhibition, permanent exhibition, temporary exhibition that we do within the museum. So we have a lot to think about, a lot to work on, both independently and collaboratively. And as a final note, I want to mention or emphasize again that the collections are accessible to anyone who is interested in seeing them. If you're not sure about the process, you can approach me later and I'll explain. Also to your students or anyone, specifically source communities, who wants to engage with the collection. It's there, it's accessible to everyone. And I also want to mention one final thing about the international training program that we have running right now, where we bring museum professionals from around the world to engage with the collections, learn from basically best practices, at least from the British Museum, but also share information and collaborate on ideas that we have in the museum. So I don't know if and when was the last time we had a museum professional from the Caribbean. So if you have anyone in mind, again, please come and talk to me. We'll love to have someone from the Caribbean next year in this training program. With this, again, I'll finish, and I'll thank you again for this invitation. Thank you.